bevo.com.
Unquestionably one of the world leaders in business, finance and philanthropy, John Studzinski, welcome to Bevo.
Great to be here, thank you.
John, there's been a lot of studies recently about sort of CEOs and what do great ones do. In your opinion, what is the difference between a world-class CEO and one that's just destined for mediocrity?
Well, the world-class CEO is, I think, coincides with something I was told at the very beginning of my career, which is world-class, and I can always tell this when I meet someone new who's a brand new CEO, I always know whether they're going to succeed or fail based on one thing, and it's just that. And it's basically whether they're good at the art of listening. And it's all about the art of listening. And it's very interesting. The first 6 months, the new CEOs doing this sort of honeymoon tour, the ones that sort of walk in with great bravado, sort of have their style, they've gotten there, they know what they're doing. You could tell they're listening politely, but they're not really listening. 8, 9 out of 10 times, those guys fall on their face, and they lose, and they fail. The ones that succeed are the ones that go in there with an open mind, a clean sheet of paper, and they're there to listen. They're there to listen to all of their stakeholders, their employees, their predecessors, the old board members, the new board members, the new shareholders, the old shareholders, and they listen. And they make sure that they continue to listen once their honeymoon is over. Listening, it's the old art that if you, as a good CEO, 80 to 90% of what you need to know to do your job well, you'll get if you actually take the time and have the self-confidence, and sometimes it means admitting you're wrong and changing course, if you actually take the time to listen.
Yeah, John, it's interesting you say that because I think a lot of CEOs think that because they're the CEO, they must know the right answer. But as you said, sometimes the answer is with your team. You have to listen to get the team out and also be willing to change if you have the courage.
You know, it's actually the reverse. If you look at military history, some of the great generals in front of the troops would stand up and say, you know, congratulate the troops, the battle, here's what we did right, great battle. But, you know, I thought about this, and here are 2 or 3 things that I could have done better, I did wrong. And the troops go, whew, that guy is really confident if he can get up there and tell you what he did wrong. Same thing applies to CEOs. Really smart CEOs that stand up and say, well, actually, you know, last year there were 2 or 3 things I wasn't happy about. It not only shows that they're human, because there's been a lot of interesting work in the last couple of years that deal with this sort of notion of human condition and humanity. And CEOs that show they're human and that they're introspective and self-aware about their strengths and their weaknesses, their successes and their failures, they tend to be seen as much better leaders, and they seem to be much more respected, and their troops are much more excited about following them.
John, what would you say is the best piece of advice you've ever received in either business or management?
The best piece of advice I received was when I was a second-year associate at Morgan Stanley, and I was with the then chairman, Parker Gilbert, and we were going up to a meeting at a corporate blue-chip client in Connecticut, and somehow the rest of the team became ill, and there I was as a second-year associate with the chairman, and the managing director, the vice president, and the senior associate were all missing in action. And I was a bit sort of sweaty palms and rather apprehensive. He knew I was rather nervous, and he looked at me knowing that I was going to have to give a lot of the presentation and knowing that this was going to be a very difficult meeting. And he said, just remember one thing. Most of what you need to know in life, particularly in a complicated meeting, you'll learn by just keeping your mouth shut and listening. And you know, I applied that comment to you with respect to a good CEO. I think it's particularly relevant in this society where you have all these alpha males and alpha females who think they're a bit like sort of dancing bears or performing seals, that they have to constantly prove to you how smart they are. But actually, I think the truth is the reverse. The notion of less is more. Knowing to shut up, choose your moments, and choose your words, almost in a more stealth-like fashion. And perhaps in front of that board or in front of that client, you'll have an even wiser and a perhaps more potent impact.
John, you're very passionate about what you do, so how important is passion in an individual's business success?
You've got to find out what people are passionate about, because everybody is passionate about something. I think when people reach a certain age, whether it's 45, 50, 55, 60, you start to see that lots of things are important. A career is important, contributing to the planet's important, financial survival is important, but a family, children, passion, that's all very important. But not one thing is important. And I think people that have many legs on their table, and I think you notice you need at least 3 legs for the table to stand up. And if you have 4 or 5 legs, then the table will be very, very solid. I think people that only have 1 or 2 legs on their table falls over pretty quickly.
John, you once said that you've remained in banking for almost 30 years because you love the people side of the business. And in fact, I quote, "I like the element of advising people, the element of trust, the element of theatre in the business. It's fascinating because it's all about the human condition." So is this, you think, one of the reasons why you've been so successful? And do you think enough CEOs put the people side as high enough on the agenda?
No, I think good CEOs, good leaders are inherently realize that their biggest resource is the human factor. And I think really good CEOs understand the purpose of a corporate culture, the purpose of human dignity in the workplace, and respecting each individual's contribution to the team, namely the mosaic, the composite, sort of the whole, is greater than the sum of the parts.
John, I was once told you've got a lot of time for high performers, not that much time for the low performers. So in actual fact, you can be a disaster for the low performers that are hanging out around you. But do you think Jack Welch was right about the bottom 5-10% and moving them on? And how do you deal with the level of talent you've got in a group?
So there's an element of the 360 evaluation process where people are evaluated by people who they work for, and they evaluate people sort of above them. They evaluate their peer groups, and they're evaluated. And part of that process is actually aimed at finding people's strengths as well as the areas that need further development. So I think it's important, first of all, before you can manage people and decide who the bottom 5% is in your sort of Jack Welch concept, you first of all need to decide what people's strengths and weaknesses are, because you can't compare people. Not all people are apples, not all people are bananas, not all people are pears. No two people are alike. And if you're a good manager, you'll spend most of your time understanding someone's strengths, and you'll manage around their weaknesses. It's very important you do that. Successful organizations have strong people who actually are complemented by people who supplement their weaknesses. If you think you have very strong people who are perfect, you are not living in the real world. Very strong people have support systems that compensate, cover up, or modify their weaknesses.
Perfect, because I think we're sort of brought up in the sort of educational world as well. Even at school, you've got 3 A's in this, and you've got 4 D's in 4 other subjects. You're focused to get the D's to C's, as opposed to just focusing on your A group. So that's almost like it comes through. But in business, what you're saying is absolutely focus on the strengths and support and allow for the weaknesses.
No two people are alike, and a good manager will actually cultivate and nurture someone's strengths. And a lot of it has to do with bringing out someone's self-confidence and nurturing them, taking an interest in them personally, taking an interest in their career, letting them take some risk and see where they can thrive, but being very tough with them on areas where they need further development. It's a bit like growing a tree. At some point the tree needs to be allowed to grow, bigger root system, and then at some point the tree has to be pruned, and sometimes very aggressively. And if it's pruned very aggressively and you get the shape of the tree you want, then you let it grow for a couple of years, and then you shape it again. And there's a very specific discipline about tree pruning, and a lot of that discipline actually is analogous to how people are allowed to evolve. You don't want to ever inhibit the creative process, the innovative process. You want great people to evolve, but at the same time, you have to you have to provide some guidance, some parameters. You've got to nurture, but at the same time, you have to discipline.
So mentorship, is that something
I think mentoring is important. You have to encourage. You get so much more from talented people by sitting down with them and saying, you did 5 great things over the last 6 months. Let me tell you about them. And let me tell you why they're great. And I think one of the society things that's happened in the last several years is people have become very self-critical and very competitive. And senior management doesn't take enough time. And one of the reasons for it is, I know what I'm good at. Just tell me what I'm bad at. Well, actually, you may know what you're good at, but you actually need to hear about it, and you need to think about it, because it tells you a lot more about yourself and will help you actually become even more self-aware.
John, I understand that you know and you spend time with the guru Charles Handy. Has there been any one insight that you've taken away from him that's been most valuable to you?
Yeah, well, Charles Handy is very important in my life. I've known him for 20 years. He is single-handedly insightful on a number of things, but in particular, he makes one think, okay, if you're not careful, you'll get on a treadmill, and it's whether it's your job or your life or your personal life, and you'll just stay on that treadmill because you won't look at the speed of the treadmill or the direction of the treadmill or whether the treadmill is old or new. And what he does is he really makes you think about being more self-aware. Are you being challenged? And as a result of that, I have a rule of thumb in life, which is if I'm operating in my comfort zone, I think that's a bad thing. We should never operate in your comfort zone because it's taking your life and your time left on the planet for granted. You always should push yourself quickly and abruptly out of your comfort zone and into something where you're back on some aspect of a steep or inclined learning curve. And Charles has been very good at that. And he also helps one to be very, very aware of the importance of being self-aware.
John, your comfort zone must be pretty wide. So can you give me an example of a time that you purposefully went out of your comfort zone to grow and learn and acquire new things?
Well, I think we all should push ourselves out of comfort zones. I mean, one of the reasons I left Morgan Stanley, I had 24 great years at Morgan Stanley, and one of the reasons I left was I felt that I needed the challenge of a different type of financial institution, which is why I chose to go to HSBC. It was a very different type of financial institution, and I knew I would have a different set of issues. It's a big, multinational, very first-class financial institution with a strong culture towards corporate lending and retail. And really in HSBC, I was pushed out of my comfort zone and I learned a lot about credit. I learned a lot about Asia, emerging markets, China, India, Mexico. And that was very different. That was a very, very new and important learning curve.
John, I understand that you got very fed up with the London traffic in terms of the time wasted in the back of a car. So you adapted your vehicle to have an office in the back of your car. So assuming that we don't all have that ability to do it, what advice do you have for people to get maximum value out of the time that they have?
I'm very conscious of the need to multitask. I'm very conscious of 3 or 4 things. Number one, being very disciplined about time management, being very disciplined about respecting my PA's management of my diary, and therefore if she spends a lot of time structuring a very thoughtful diary, I'm not going to change it at the last minute because A, it's disrespectful to her, and B, she's worked very hard to arrange phone calls, meetings, and other things, so I have to stick to the program. It cannot change. Some people just start the day and think, well, this is sort of a general parameter, and I'm just going to But actually, if you want to accomplish a lot in a day, you have to stick to the program. The other thing is one thinks about the whole year, and the year, I think about my diary over a 12 to 18 month period. I decide whether I'm going to be in America or in London or in China or India well in advance. And I think carefully on a weekend about who are the people I need to speak to over the next 2 weeks. And my office then becomes aware of that, and the whole thing is thought about and planned. So you can do all these things, and by having a car where I can actually operate within the car, that allows me to operate across London. I mean, it happened actually when I was at Morgan Stanley and HSBC. The commute from Chelsea to Canary Wharf could be anywhere between 35 and 60 minutes. So that was downtime unless you could actually be on the telephone or be actually dealing with the internet.
John, whether you're at HSBC Bank, Morgan Stanley or the Blackstone Group, you always get to the very top of your industry or your profession. So what 2 or 3 success habits have you incorporated that has enabled you to get to the top every time?
It's interesting. I think when people start out in their career, and particularly in banking, they ask me, how do I become a successful banker? And I always say it's the 3 Ds. It's deadlines, detail, and data. And if you're going to be successful for the first 5 to 10 years of your career, you've got to be good at deadlines, managing expectations in terms of getting things done. You've got to be good at data, namely getting the numbers right. And you've got to be very good at detail, namely making sure that everything is checked, double-checked, and all the documents are perfectly correct. Now, roll the camera forward. Later on in one's career, sort of years 10, 20, 25, 30, I think it's people, perspicacity, and dignity. And that has more to do with realizing the business is all about people. It's all about paying attention to people, trying to be perspicacious in terms of what makes people tick. That's why in this world it's very challenging, because we're constantly doing video conferences, we're sending emails, there's a lot of technology, and the technology actually jams or intrudes upon real perspicacity. And therefore it's incumbent upon people to still spend a real face time together, seeing people one-on-one, eye contact, body language, and the nuances of being together. And the third element after people perspicacity is dignity. I think as you get older and as you travel around the planet, how people treat each other, and remember, it's not about money. It's about the element of the human condition. How I respect your job, your position, your culture, your language, your family, and how I respect your dignity is very, very important. And we're seeing this in spades right now during this sort of so-called Great Recession, where the job is the biggest source of dignity. Again, it's not about money. It's about getting up in the morning and knowing that you have a job, which for most people on the planet determines your self-worth, beyond whether someone loves you, or whether you have children, or whether you have a whole range of activities.
Brilliant. Because I know that you also surround yourself by highly successful people, and I understand your you hold some great dinner parties with some of these top level people. If ever you want to invite me, I'll be free for that evening, I can promise you. But have you noticed there being sort of 2 or 3 characteristics that are common to all of the sort of highly successful people that you come across and you know?
You know, you use the word highly successful. I think that's the wrong word. I mean, people who come to dinner, they all have a different position on the planet. And I think there's a great objective to introduce people to other people at a dinner party that they would not normally meet in their normal walk of life. So to seat an actress next to a banker, or a great writer next to a politician, or an editor next to a rather esoteric painter. So these people are all successful. They're all unique. They all have an important role on the planet. And they're all successful perhaps in their own way, but they're not successful based on any one definition.
No. John, the finance world is changing very fast. So what do you think the future of investment banking will be, and particularly perhaps some of the pure play investment banks like Goldman Sachs?
But investment banking goes back to about 1850, when the sort of notion of investment banking was sort of Junius Morgan, City of London, and Junius Morgan defined investment banking as the sources and uses of capital and the crossroads of capital. In other words, you find capital and you redeploy it and you invest it with projects or with people or companies that need it. But the truth is, you can go back to the Medicis, you can go back to the Egyptians, you can go back to the Romans, and there was capital being reinvested into certain projects that actually produced money. So if you look at the investment banker as being the man or the woman or the institution that stand at the crossroads of capital, there is always going to be a need for an investment banker. What they're going to be doing has a lot to do with themselves being smart, nimble enough to reinvent themselves. Where is the next need going to be? Where's the next place where they can make money? And at the end of the day, it's going to be about understanding the planet and understanding the shifts of where are the new sources and the old sources of wealth and capital, and most importantly, this new word that no one knows anything about called liquidity. And then where are the places for the uses of capital, namely where they're going to be invested. I know I'm sounding rather sort of pompous on this discussion, but I think people realize investment banking is not just about defining whether banks are going to be banks in the current form. They're not going to be in the current form. If they're going to survive, some of the most successful organizations. Why is Goldman Sachs so successful? Because if you look at Goldman Sachs carefully since it was founded, it's been the most astute organization at marginally, incrementally reinventing itself and always staying a step ahead of the market in a very entrepreneurial, eye-opening way, managing capital, managing risk, but also doing it in a marginally fearless fashion. They have reinvented themselves, and that's why, from a Darwinian point of view, they're still the strongest.
So do you think constant innovation and reinvention, particularly in a world that's changing so fast, is one of the key components of a great organization?
I think the reality is a good corporation and a good chairman, board, and CEO have to, first of all, clarify what is their corporate culture. And it's a terrible expression because it sounds rather old and sort of dusty. But at the end of the day, particularly in this environment, actually, most recruits are more interested in corporate culture and defining corporate culture than they are necessarily knowing what their first year's salary or total compensation is going to be. Corporate culture to them is a lot about who are the types of people they're working with, what are their values, what are their morals, what does the firm stand for? Is the firm interested in innovation? Is it interested in risk? Is it interested in managing the status quo, or is it interested in redefining the future? So there is an element of corporate culture that has to deal with both, on one level, with values, integrity, and also going back to what we talked about earlier, human dignity. Is the person respected in the workplace for their own personal talent and acumen and contribution? And at the same time, am I going to be allowed to, how much of my time is going to be spent on allowing to create or to innovate or to take some chances? I mean, people at a certain point in their life need to be thrown into the deep end of the pool. They need to be pushed out of their comfort zone, and they need to be challenged. And a lot of bright people love to be challenged. And many firms do it intentionally, as they should, to find out who can swim in 4 feet of water, who can swim in 8 feet of water, and who can swim in a very deep sea. And no two people are the same.
John, there seems to be more new sources of liquidity and wealth creation currently found in the East than in the West. Do you think that this trend is here to stay?
If you go back to sort of the Panic of 1874, Panic of 1874 had America growing high GDP growth rates, high economic growth rates, a lot of excess capital, excess liquidity. was used to support the need for further capital and liquidity in Central and Western Europe. So at that point you had a new economy, America, evolving and supporting an older economy, Western Europe. And there were a lot of similar characteristics about property valuation, the need for balance of payments, and what have you. You now have a situation where the new economies, relatively new economies, greater sources of wealth and liquidity are going to come from Asia, and they are, of course, at the moment, providing a lot of investment and liquidity for North America and Western Europe. And there's no question that that's a permanent change, and it's a fact of life.
John, you're a very well-known philanthropist. I understand in the past you've donated £5 million to the Tate, £10 million to set up the Genesis Foundation, and so forth. So how do you decide where to donate your money?
Normally I back things I'm passionate about. I'm passionate about anything that has to do with dignity, whether it's the homeless, human rights, or nurturing young artists whose dignity and self-esteem needs a bit of a boost. And within philanthropy, we normally back people. You back an organization and support somebody who's particularly impressive, someone that's a leader, someone that's an innovator, someone that's a pioneer. You don't just back organizations, you back people at organizations, or you back individuals who are beginning their career.
John, a lot of people, I think that they've got to wait until they're super high net worth individuals before they start being philanthropists. But is that the case?
Philanthropy is not about money. Philanthropy is about mind share of someone's daily life and how much of their day they're giving to somebody else or some other cause, and where they become more selfless. And therefore it's not about you, it's about them, and it's about thinking about, can I help by giving, one of my projects is a new 3-year-old charity in New York called DKMS, which is does nothing but bone marrow matching of leukemia patients who need to find the right bone marrow match. And anyone up until the age of 55 can take a swab and donate, be a donator for a bone marrow match. And you've now had lots of examples in the United States of people living and surviving leukemia as a result of having the right match. And this is a relatively new project. It's only 3 years old in America. It's been in Germany for a little longer time period. But it's effectively you're giving up something that a healthy person can easily give up, which is a bone marrow match. And in many cases, you're saving a life. That doesn't cost you any money, but it costs you a willingness to be part of that bone marrow network. So I think there are a lot of people who can play a role in philanthropy which will actually nurture their own ego and nurture their own self-esteem and make them feel like they're a broader-based human being. I keep using this analogy of the table. Many people can spend time doing things, whether they give time, they give energy, they give money. A lot of people just give network and give access to other people who might, at the right point in time, provide a useful introduction or a useful piece of guidance or information. Philanthropy is not about checkbooks, and I get annoyed because I think checkbook philanthropy is the worst form of philanthropy because it's cold, it's sterile, and it's a bit like a one-night stand. It has a purpose, but it doesn't really have any long-lasting impact either, I think, on the charity nor on the individual giving.
Interesting, John. So do you think there's anything we can do from the sort of the countrywide perspective to make sure that we embed philanthropy even more into our culture?
Now, I think one of the things that this country can do and other countries can do, and the Obama administration is very conscious of it, is to try to reintroduce a much more service-oriented society, namely where children, and at one point the Prime Minister Gordon Brown in this country talked about this with I think it was the Russell Commission, trying to encourage children to give up, and even as part of their core curriculum, a certain number of hours a week volunteering time. even if you get a sort of 10-year-old child to volunteer 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours max a week, you would be surprised that if that child does that for 10 years, volunteerism and the value of donating time will be inculcated on that child for life. And the child will understand that that's a greater gift, giving time, than actually just thinking that it's all about, oh, I have to have money to be a philanthropist. No, I have to give time to be a philanthropist. I don't necessarily have to have money to be a philanthropist.
John Studzinski, thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure to have you on Bevo.
You're welcome.
Bevo